As a Seattle-based attorney who's handled a lot of domestic violence cases throughout the Puget Sound region and runs a firm that handles domestic violence cases, I want to talk to people a little bit about an important distinction, at least from my perspective as defense counsel, between isolated incidents of violence and a pattern of conduct. It's important for people to realize that domestic violence, at least as a label for anybody that's involved in these kinds of cases, automatically has an implication to a certain type of behavior which would be called a cycle of violence. And I think traditionally a lot of legislation surrounding domestic violence came into being to stamp out that type of behavior, or provide in particular women who were stuck in a cycle of violence a way out of it, and use the court system to control and shrink the number of people that are stuck in this kind of cycle. A cycle of violence really reflects a relationship that's based on a dynamic of power and control, where the primary party, generally the male, will use physical violence and limit, use emotional and financial and any form of manipulation to establish a relationship where they are in power and control over the other party, and that other party's wishes and needs are, if they were clear-headed, they would realize that they're not being met and they would leave. But because of this cycle of violence, this threat, this fear, this manipulation, they're unable to. Domestic violence that matches a pattern of conduct will be treated harsher and will be more aggressively prosecuted in the criminal system in general than cases of isolated incidents of physical conduct or physical contact. So if you have an isolated fight that happened at a moment of frustration over a 15-year-old who is having behavioral issues, but this is not a pattern, inherently the court system should, and in my experience, in my representation, does treat that case different than a case that is part of a larger cycle of violence and control. The list can go on. The reasons why people have a physical assault on another person is endless. It could be based on frustration, it could be based on a bad day, it could be based on substance abuse, it can be based on someone cheating on the other person, it could be based on, the list goes on. When the behavior is really done to drive a cycle of violence, to get established power and control, well, that's completely different. And so it's very important, if you are charged with a domestic violence crime, which means a crime that happened between two people in an intimate relationship, that your lawyer and you go through the time, or take the time, to distinguish your situation from a pattern of behavior, if that's appropriate. It's also important for you and your lawyer to talk about if there is a situation where you're being falsely accused of a pattern of behavior. I have dealt with a number of cases where, for purposes of positioning in relation to divorce cases, for purposes of positioning in relation to getting a primary residence, I have seen false accusations surface under these circumstances, and generally always the woman will claim that there have been multiple acts of prior violence that are unsubstantiated, but she makes that accusation to fit within the idea that she is a victim of a cycle of violence. So I think that gives you a larger idea of the issues that are at play when you enter a courtroom or when you're charged with a crime, and in particular the issue of whether or not you are accused of or are involved in a pattern of behavior that would be called the cycle of violence versus an isolated incident driven by other circumstances. And I think this video should give people an idea of why it's important to distinguish the two.